Okay, so step 2 includes the wiring that's needed for the controller board. And these are the things that you're going to need. Don't worry about this. I'll show you what I've done with this. You're going to need 2 XLR connectors, male and a female. You're going to need possibly a set of crimpers and some fork terminals, although that is completely optional. You can just tin the wires and stick them directly in the power supply as bare wires. I like to put those tips on it. That's an option that you can do. You're going to need a soldering iron and some solder. Get ready for that. You will need a cutter to cut the lengths of wire. I've already cut them before starting this video. And you're going to need wire strippers of some sort. And you can always use cutters as strippers, or even the crimper has strippers in it. So it's optional to have an additional tool for that. But I'm going to use it in here. So what I did here was I created a box. I just went to Home Depot and I got a case. And I got a box here with a front panel on it that has 2 XLR connectors. And they're not connected to anything on the inside, but what I use them for is when I solder the wires, it does 2 things. First of all, it gives me a stand to put them in. So when I punch this one out here, this is the male plug. Here it is. And that's going to go, of course, into the female receptacle. And now I have easy access to the wires, and they're held in place, and I don't have to put them on a alligator clip or something. So that's all that this box is for. The other thing that I've done is I've written on the box where each of the wires goes, because sometimes it gets confusing when you're looking at the chart. The chart, by the way, is included in your list of documents. You'll have a wiring chart for the DMX, and it will tell you which wires go to which position. But it sometimes gets confusing because when you're looking at from the top, the wires are in one position, but from behind they're in the opposite position. And this way it removes all guessing as to which side you're looking at and whatever, because it tells me that pin number 2, which is the black wire, is on this side on the male plug and on this side on the female plug, because once they plug together they have to mate up. And then pin 3 is at the bottom on both of them, which is the red wire, and the shield, which is the bare wire, goes on the outside too. That's pin 1. Now, if you look really close on these connectors, you'll see numbers written on them on the back, and I believe on the front as well. Maybe not. Maybe they're just on the back. But they're hard to see, and if the light isn't good and you need glasses, well, you might have a problem with that. So I built something like this as an easy way to do this. Now, of course, if you're only building one of these, then you don't need to buy all these extra things and do it. But I find it, if you do a lot of work with DMX things and you're making cables, then this will be a handy tool for you to build a little thing like this. And it costs about $10 in parts. So I've got here a black and a red 18 gauge wire. That's going to be for the power supply. And I've got 2 DMX sections of DMX cable. All of these are 6 feet long. So they reach out of the skull, go down through the neck, and give you 4 feet or so distance to connect another regular DMX connector to, and your power supply. Of course, your power supply can be further away than that. You just have to add length to your wire, or cut your wires longer if you want to have your power supply placed further away. Here's the power supply. It's only going to be used to in this step to power up the board and center all the servos. So let's get started. I'm going to do this with the wires. I am going to strip away a little bit of wire for the end that goes into the controller board. Don't leave too much. Quarter of an inch maybe of wire on each side. You can see the bare wires there. Sometimes I will twist them so we don't get any stray strands of wire. Okay, now I will leave that bare, and I'm not going to tin these wires. These go right into the controller board. The controller board grips them better if they're bare wires, because it can sink its teeth into them a little bit. So you will also see in your documents a list of what all of the pins and plugs on this board are for. It's under the DMX wiring chart. And you'll see the picture of the board and show you where everything goes. So Servo Power Plus goes in this very first connector, and you can use a very tiny screwdriver to push down these orange tabs, push them way down in, slide the wire in, release it. That's in there good and tight. Now, again, one of the reasons why you wouldn't, well, you want to make sure they're only this long is you don't want the bare wires sticking out far enough that they could possibly touch each other. Now I'm going to push down on the ground connector, and right there, it just bent a wire because I did not twist it tightly enough. So now I'm retwisting that wire. Make sure we don't want a stray wire sticking out. Sometimes it's hard to see one strand of wire, and if that goes over to the positive side, then you get a problem. Okay, now those are two, they're both in there, and they're in there good. They're not coming out. That's our power wire on that end. On the other end, I'm simply going to crimp on my connectors just because that's the way I like to do it. And again, that's completely optional. I think it gives it a more finished professional look, but no one really is ever going to see that in your setup. They're not going to be looking at your power supply. Again, twisting the wires. I'm going to take out the crimp. I'll use the red one on the red wire for obvious reasons. And that helps you, well, you can see the color of the wire, so you don't really need help identifying which is which. And I just crimp it on. That squeezes that on. And since they don't make these connectors with a black side, I use blue for the negative. So far, I have not been able to find them in black, which would have been handy, but that's the way it is. All right, so now your power is all ready to go. That is ready to be plugged into the power supply and turned on. My power supply is currently off, but I'm not going to connect the wires until I'm done. So now this is going to take a little bit more time. We're going to strip these wires down and solder them to here. And then the other side, we're going to strip bare wires and stick them into this tiny screw down connector. Now these wires I tin, and I'll show you how to do that with a soldering iron when we get to it. But the reason I do that is because as this is a spring-loaded piece of metal that sinks into the wire to hold it in place, this is a screw that squeezes down on it. And tinning the wires prevents a stray strand from getting out and makes them a little stiffer, easier to put into place. And it doesn't matter because these are screw-down connectors. You can make them nice and tight even though the wires are soldered. So that's why there's a difference between this wire and that wire. So now I'm going to use these strippers and very carefully strip back some of the shield, not the shield, the plastic cover, without cutting through any of the wires inside. And if you don't do that a lot, it might take a little practice so that you don't accidentally cut through, especially this piece of wire right here, which is the ground or the shield. Now you've got some tinfoil material here that you got to get rid of so you can get at the wires inside. And I just twist it a little bit on the side and then snip it off, that shield. But that runs the entire length of the wire. Now I've got these two little positions. I'm going to strip those. So I've got just a tiny bit of wire sticking out. And then I twist everything. Okay. So now, if you can see that on against the white table there, you've got your red wire here stripped from about there to the end, the black wire in the middle stripped from there to here, and the plain old shield bare wire exposed right there. So now I'm going to tin all of these wires, and what that means, because solder has a high content of tin, they call it tinning the wire. So I've got my soldering iron nice and hot here. I'm going to hit up the solder, hold it together there, and just melt it into the wire. That will prevent the strands from separating on you, and will give the wire a nice stiff connection. And even right down on the bare wire. Okay. So there's that one. Now, to make it easier, I'm also going to tin the connections that I'm hooking it up to. We're going to do the male plug first, which is on this side. And I'm just going to throw a little solder in each of the 3 connections where we're going to connect this thing. And that makes it really easy. When I just apply the soldering iron to that section, it heats up the solder and melts the solder both in the wire and in the connector, and makes a really good, quick connection. It hardens very quickly as well, so it doesn't take a lot of time to do that. So I'm going to start with the shield, which on this particular connector is pin 1 right here. And I'm going to slide that down in a little bit, melt that solder, slide it in, done. There's that connection. Okay, now the next connection on this one, I'm going to do the other side, the opposite side, which is the black wire. And that goes onto pin 2. And I don't know if you can see that too well, but my hand might be in the way. I'm going to connect that onto pin 2. Same way. Heat up the solder that was in there, and the solder on the wire. Pin 2 is in there. Good. And now pin 3, the red wire, is on the bottom. And I'm going to place that in place, and again, heat up the solder on both connection and wire. And there we go. Now if I look at it, and that looks a little thin on solder on that connection, so I'm going to add a little bit just to make sure it doesn't come apart. It all depends. You'll have to look at them yourself and determine whether you're going to need a little extra solder in those connections or not. In this case, it looks like I did on those 2. First one went out pretty good by itself. Okay, so that's that end. I'm going to take care of the other end of the wire, and then we'll solder up the other one, which you don't have to watch. It's exactly the same process. And so I'll cut the video there and then show you. So I've got the same wire. I've got the other end, and I'm going to, this is the end that's going to be connected to the controller card. There we go. Took that off. Same process here. You're going to find the little shield wire. Always make sure in your workspace that you've got no little pieces, little balls of solder or strands of wire on the desk, because when we bring the controller card over and set it down on the desk, you don't want anything to short out anything on the bottom of it. So be very conscious of your workspace. Make sure there's no filaments of wire, little pieces. If you've been trimming the ends of wire, you get little tiny bits, and that could easily get picked up by the bottom of that controller card. So now I'm going to use these screws, these 6 screws here. They are basically just parallel inputs, so it doesn't really matter which one you plug to which side, but I always plug the input, which we're doing here, to this side. Before we can slide these on, we have to put back together the case for this. If you forget, you're going to end up having to pull this off again and put the pieces back on. So this is the male connector, which is this side. So we have to get all of the pieces back on. So this piece here is the interior piece. This goes on first, and it goes on so that the pointed side goes inside of the outer shield, the case. And what that does is when you screw the shield down, that insert pushes on the end to make sure it's as far as it can be into this front of the case. Now I'm just going to lower these down to where I have this connector. Now you see that little shield fits nicely right there. This goes on here, and now we push the inside all the way up until you can see the 3 pins in there. Now we just screw it on. I hate it when you connect both ends of the wires and you've forgotten to put the case back on, because then you got to take something apart. Okay, now we spread out these wires, and on my little chart here, which is just out of camera shot, but it's I'm looking right at it on a wall in front of me, it tells me that the shield goes into the first connector, the minus wire, or the black wire, goes into the middle, and the red wire goes into the third. So I am placing them all in that order. I might have to back off these screws a little bit. There we go, 1, 2, and 3. And now I'm going to screw them down, and I'll give you a close-up on the camera of that. Now I've just got to do the other wire, and I'll go ahead and do that right now. And we'll skip over it in the video, or speed it up for you, so you don't have to watch it in real time. Fully wired up. Now we're ready to put this all together and wire up our 3-axis plates.